Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Today is a good day. We are in our new studio here in the iconic offices in Dublin, and I am delighted to bring you a brand new series, this time called Brains, Beliefs and Biases, and we're going to kick off with a book by Bobby Duffy called The Perils of Perception. Before we do, I want to thank our sponsor Zai, who's enabled us to upgrade the show, the equipment, the camera that I'm recording on, a little too HD for my own liking, the microphone, the sound. Hopefully everything's getting a bit better, and I want to thank them. They are boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded products and services, empowering businesses to move funds with ease and enable multiple payment workflows. You can check out Zai at hellozai.com. For now, let's get into part one of Brains, Beliefs and Biases with Bobby Duffy on Perils of Perception. 1 in 10 French people still believe the earth may be flat. 1/4 of Australians think that cavemen and dinosaurs existed at the same time. 1 in 9 Brits think the 9/11 attacks were a US government conspiracy. 15% of Americans believe that the media or government adds secret mind-controlling signals to television transmissions. Our main interest in today's book is not niche stupidity or minority belief in conspiracies, but much more general and widespread misperceptions about individual, social, and political realities. Today's book, informed by 10 exclusive major polling studies by Ipsos across 40 countries, asks why in the age of the internet, where information should be more accessible than ever before, we remain so poorly informed. It is a pleasure to welcome the author of that book, The Perils of Perception, Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything. Bobby Duffy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Aidan. Great to be here.
It's great to have you on the show, Bobby. I've been a long time waiting to share this brilliant book that's here behind me, and I highly recommend it to our audience. I was telling you before I came on air, it's so essential reading for anybody who's making decisions, whether that's for a big organization, a transformation agent, or in your own life itself. It's so fascinating, and we'll get into it in a second, but I'd love to hear about the origins of the book, because you share in the book that throughout your life, you've had a lingering sensitivity to psychological tricks, and you've spent the last 20 years at opinion research firm Ipsos Mori, designing and dissecting research from around the world to help understand what people think and do and why. For over a decade, you've run hundreds of surveys on public misperceptions, and this is what you call the perils of perception. I'd love you to share the origin story of how this all came about.
Well, I guess for these studies in particular, it started with work we were doing in the UK for Number 10 on how people felt about crime and crime rates. So it's because there was a lot of focus on reducing crime at that time. This was sort of early in Tony Blair government in the UK. A lot of focus on reducing crime, a lot more investment going into the police, all of those types of things. But when you ask people in surveys whether crime was going up or down and how safe they felt, the public perception was everything was getting worse on crime, even though all the stats were showing it was getting better and all the investment was going in. And so that sort of that kind of piqued my interest in perceptions of realities, measurable realities, things that not like opinions and not things that are in doubt, but things you can actually measure pretty well. And what do the public think of those realities? Do they get them right or wrong? And the reason being, not like a test. It's not about intelligence or to prove people are right or wrong on particular things, but to try to understand when they're wrong, what does that signify? Because I guess that's the kernel of the book, is that these perceptions of realities are really rich, particularly when people are wrong, because there's all sorts of reasons that we get them wrong, and that's where the social psychology comes into it. This is not an IQ test. This is about how we see the world, and how we see the world is basically a function of two big buckets of things: what we're told and how we think. And that's what I really enjoyed unpicking, is the interaction between those two things, the information that we see and things that we experience, but then how we process that, and then what that tells us about ourselves.
It's absolutely fascinating, and it's something that's always been on my mind is about being a parent, is to be very careful what I say to my children, because you absolutely color their perceptions of the world. Even comments about the neighbor, the pesky neighbor and everything, and then maybe they become more against neighbors, etc. All those type of things are in my mind, but you really add the science and the surveys behind it. But I thought, Bobby, we'd start with a big question you ask at the start of the book, and I'll ask that question perhaps to our audience and then let you unpack how it unfolded for you, because this one is remarkable. I tested this out during the week with people, and I'd like our audience to think about this themselves for a moment before you unpack it and answer it, which is the Great Wall of China visible from outer space? And think about that for a second as an audience member, people watching us or listening to us, and think about what you truly think about that. And then Bobby will unpack what he has found through surveys and through his research.
It's such a simple question, but it illustrates in different ways the kind of some of the main themes of the book. So the reality is that it's not visible from outer space, from all the best research that I can find on it. After quite a lot of digging, I had to do a lot of looking around on this. But when you ask in surveys, and probably among your audience, certainly whenever I present this at different conferences, about 50% believe it is. And that's pretty consistent, actually. I've done it in very different audiences, and the surveys have been run in a wide range of different countries. And it's always about half of people think it is, which is really interesting, where you've got a reality that is pretty well known and measured, but half of publics and populations think you've got the wrong answer. And when you think about it, when you sort of pause, you do think, actually, it's a bit weird that you would think it's visible from outer space, because at its widest, it's only 9 meters wide, which is about the same size as a regular house. So it is incredibly large, but it's its length that gives it that property. It is one of the largest, still one of the largest man-made structures on Earth, but it's its length that gives it, and that's not going to make it visible from outer space. Something being very long. So this, I break this down a bit into, there's 4 or 5 different things that this shows. First of all, shows what Daniel Kahneman would talk about as fast thinking, where he splits into system 1 and system 2 thinking. Daniel Kahneman being, a godfather of social psychology and the behavioral science kind of knowledge that we've got today. And that fast thinking, system 1 thinking, is you probably didn't think about this question very much. You just sort of reacted to it. You're not really searching and considering length versus width and scale in order to work it out. We do also mix scales. That's the second one, where we do think of length as being important. That's the sheer size of this, the number of bricks that are in the Great Wall of China being one of the things that we'd think of. But we also have a third one, is that we also have this illusory truth bias, it's called, which is where you hear something. The more you hear something, the more you're likely to believe it's true, even if there's no real evidence for that. So the second time and third time you hear a lie or a mistruth, the more likely you are to believe it. And that's shown in lots of different experiments. And that's certainly the case with the Great Wall of China, because it was even an incorrect answer on a Trivial Pursuit question, that it was visible from outer space. But then there's a couple of other points, and maybe the most important from the book's point of view, we sort of want it to be true. It's a really interesting fact that we could build, and particularly, that many centuries ago, people could build something that's visible from outer space is really interesting. And it's more emotional than we think it is. It's kind of, we're attached to that interesting fact. And we sort of want it to be true. So that's one of the key themes of the book, is that our emotions and identities on other issues are tied up in our views of reality. And that's really important. But there is a fifth and final point that I think is really important on this, which is that people do change their minds. If in audiences, when I ask this question and then answer it with people kind of usually believe me when I tell them that it's not true. There's a lot of Googling sometimes in the audiences just to double check, but people change their minds. And this is, again, a really important theme within the book, is that while our view of reality is tied up with our identity and emotions and all sorts of things, it doesn't mean that people are completely set on that vision of reality. And you can change people's minds, because that's one of the things that sometimes people can really worry about, is we've got these misperceptions of reality and we're kind of stuck with them, and there's no convincing people that there's a different and more correct view of those realities. So it's a very simple question, but it kind of covers and illustrates a whole range of different effects that are going on that we see in other measures, maybe definitely more important measures, not these sort of trivial pursuit type questions.
It's so interesting for people in change roles, so transformation roles, which we cover a lot in the show, where you don't change the business model until you change the mental model. You don't change what people do until you change how they think. And that part you mentioned there is very encouraging, because the book, I find, is really encouraging that you can change people's perceptions. But one of the things I thought we'd put right up front, and you've inspired me to do this now, is you mentioned Daniel Kahneman, and there's a really interesting interview that you quote in the book where you say, Daniel Kahneman, who's been studying this for 45 years, goes, I've been doing this for 45 years and I haven't got any better. Yeah. And that seems kind of pessimistic in a way. But then the interview expands and you say, because he understands system 1 and system 2, and if we all do, and this is one of the inspirations behind this show, this particular episode, but in general in the show, the more information you have, we'll get into Dunning-Kruger later, that's a whole different thing. But the more information you have, the more you can spot yourself in the midst of the bias. And I think that's really important, is to train that muscle to go, Aidan, you're kind of biased about this because of your upbringing, your background, your parenting, whatever it might have been. But you need to be aware of that when you go to make the decision. I'd love you to unpack that, because that understanding that system 1, the fast system, is emotional. We can't really control that. That's inbred, baked in. But system 2, we have some control over, at least we have some awareness over.
Yeah, no, you said it really well, I think there. I think that's the system 1 is very useful, because you can't think about all these things all the time. And so what Kahneman went on to say in this is, yes, I can't change that at all, but I can, with effort, make system 2 kick in more. That is what we should be aiming in the right situations. You don't want it to be kicking in all the time, because it would be exhausting and you couldn't live like that. But it is about spotting those times and trying to make, because it's not just about emotion, it is about the biases and heuristics that we have, the shortcuts, the mental shortcuts that we have to take through life in order to live it. But you can equally have similar sorts of heuristics to help you not fall into your biases. And we will probably cover this in more of the discussion, but in the book, it is just worth being aware of. We do have these tendencies to think things are going downhill when they're not necessarily going down, that everything is getting worse. And we've got to be mindful of that, particularly if you're working in transformation. We tend to focus on negative information, and just knowing these types of that they exist in our mindset as humans is really useful, because it does give you pause to think: Am I looking at the evidence here, or am I just falling into those sorts of traps? And there's like half a dozen of those mental little ticks that you can take to say, am I being misled by myself here on what I'm seeing?
Well, let's build on that then. Seeing as you mentioned it, one of the things I thought was interesting was when you think about people in transformation roles, particularly in legacy organizations, large organizations, where they'll hark back to the good old days. And you talk about this rosy retrospection that we all are capable of or susceptible to. And I thought it was really interesting when you talked about these trust surveys that are run, etc., and the crisis of trust. And it's as if things were better in the old days, and you unpack this to show us that wasn't quite the case. This is interesting, and I'm jumping right to the end here, but just to build on to the point that you made.
Yeah, no, Razor Retrospection is very powerful, and it's there's a very interesting set of experiments by an academic called Terence Mitchell, who tried to explore this in a quite prosaic way, where he had him and his team interviewed people before they went on their holidays, before their vacation, during it, and then after it, and everyone went in the same sort of cycle of excited anticipation before you go. Then you get there and on your holiday, and it never quite goes completely to plan. The reality of minor niggles kind of set in, and you return with a sense of mild disappointment when you come back. Not just about being back, but about the experience itself. But that wasn't the point of his experiment. They kept interviewing people for a long time afterwards, and what they found is that the memory grows fonder the further away we get from it. You kind of forget the bad bits, the kids being sick in the car, or lost luggage, all of those types of things, and you remember the walks on the beach and the sunsets and whatever else. And so we do have this tendency to edit out the bad from the past, and that's quite a useful thing in the sense of it helps us let go of bad things from the past. You don't want to dwell on them necessarily, but it has this negative side effect of making us think the past was better than it was. So if you think the present and the future are worse than they are, because you've got this rosy view of the past and that everything's going downhill. And we see that in all sorts of ways in the research. So when you ask people about the murder rate in countries, 4 in 10 or up to half, depending on the country, think that the murder rate is going up. And in most countries, it's going down. And across all the countries that we looked at, it's down nearly 30%. It's not a small percentage drop. It's quite a big drop over the past 20 years. But that's not the perception. 4 in 10 think it's gone up. More, about the same, think it's about the same. And only about 15% of people think it's gone down correctly. So we've got this sense of decline, which is one of the most important things to bear in mind, because it is a general trend that cuts across these types of things and lots of other things. And it's the sort of work that Steven Pinker and Hans Rosling focused on a lot, is that this sense of worldwide decline is problematic. Not because you want everyone to think that everything is great, but the risk, and this is the one that I focus on more in my book, the risk is if people think everything is in decline, they have less faith in the system, and they're more likely to listen to people who say we need to tear it up and start again. And that's where you get into sympathy for more authoritarian or populist kind of movements in politics, and that's a worry. But in a kind of even in our day-to-day lives and in our business lives, that sense of decline is really important, because you've got really important to fight against, because again, it can mislead us into thinking we need to tear it up and start again, when actually there could be more value in it than we're thinking.
And that's really interesting, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time to talk about that, the political implications of this. When there's fear, people are more likely to go system one. They're more likely to, as you say, go to more drastic measures, and you're more likely to have holocausts in those type of mindsets as well. But you mentioned Steven Pinker there. There's a couple of things you mentioned. First, Steven Pinker, magnificent writer and thinker. He wrote a magnificent endorsement for your book. He said, mandatory reading. This mind-altering book shows how most of us are badly deluded about the state of the world. I thought that was just to say that's how much he respects this piece of work. So congrats to you. But the other thing is, some people will be thinking, as you said, that about the delusional view of the world, that, oh, well, that's educational, or that's different countries. It does. We'll get into that as well. So don't worry. Bobby covers all of that as well, and in a big way. But I thought it was interesting I'll jump back to the narrative of the book and the flow of the book, one of the interesting ones, and we've talked about this because we cover trends a lot on the show, we've covered population trends, etc. But one of the ones we talked about as well is this, the gray or the silver euro or pound or dollar, the changes in perceptions there. And another question you ask, and I'll ask our audience to think about this, is how many of your population, whatever country you're in, do you think are 65 and older? Think about that for a second. And again, Bobby, I'd love you to unpack that. Over to you.
Yeah, really interesting one as well. It's kind of, it varies a lot across the world. The reality varies a lot across the world. You've got a big range of aging societies and younger societies, obviously in more developing countries. But the pattern on estimations is the same, is that we go way too high in terms of the age of the average age, or what proportion of our population are older. So this is one of the examples where we've kind of heard about the aging population, and we have this overblown sense, or we think it's something to worry about. We know that we've got a concern about aging populations, and it's going to be more difficult in the future, and it's a challenge on our health services and having enough working age people to support older people and all of those types of things. So this is a classic example of one of the key themes of the book, which is emotional innumeracy, which is another of the key concepts in this. And that basically says that when you're estimating something and you overestimate it, for example, that cause and effect are working in both directions. So we don't just overestimate what we worry about. We worry about what we overestimate as well. So it goes in both directions. It's not when we think something is a concern or it's bad, it inflates in our minds. It takes up more of our thinking. So we think it's bigger than it really is. And we see the same sort of thing with crime rates. We see the same sort of thing with immigration levels in some countries where there is concern about immigration. And we see the same with aging population. We know it's a worry. We know it's a concern or a challenge for society. So we inflate it, and we think we've got many more older people in our countries than we actually have.
One of the ideas that is interesting is I often, when I was reading your book, I thought of the movie The Truman Show, and how it's scripted reality really, but Truman doesn't know that this is the case, which is played by Jim Carrey, and that how the information that we see can absolutely flavor our perception of the world and become our reality, because perception is reality for many people. And you say in the book that post-truth is the idea that objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And in 2016, the word post-truth was named Word of the Year by Oxford Dictionaries. You tell us further that technological shifts are particularly terrifying in their effect on our accurate view of the world or key issues, because the quantum leap in our ability to choose and others to push individual realities at us plays to some of our deepest biases in preferring our existing worldview and in avoiding conflicting information. Really important factor for disruption and innovation, this one. But that's exactly the point you were making here. If we only focus on what's out there, what we're told, we'll miss a key element of the problem, which is, as you say, it's partly how we think, not just what we think, what information we receive, that causes so much of the misperceptions that we have of the world. I thought this was such a key point, because you mentioned the innumeracy that we have, the difficulty with numbers. But when it comes to exponential numbers and changes in technology and a world that's unfolding before our eyes at a really rapid pace, we can really struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's understanding it from both of those directions of what we're told and how we think, and how what we're told is changing is really important. And I think, I mean, at the heart of that challenge with how different groups and tribal identities see realities is confirmation bias, or and disconfirmation bias. There's a group of effects that are probably best thought of as directionally motivated reasoning, or just motivated reasoning, where you've got one of our deepest biases is to look for and believe information that fits with our already held views, and to avoid or denigrate information that goes against those views. It's quite psychologically painful for us to change our minds about things, or to think that we were wrong. So we tried not to do it as much as we can. You need to reach this tipping point where the evidence and information outweighs the cost of changing your view. So if you, it creates this cognitive dissonance in us where our own views are not fitting with the reality, and it reaches a tipping point where it's actually less painful to change your view than hold on to a view that is clearly wrong to us. So this is very powerful, but it's like right at the heart of our information system, the technological information system, and in a very, very important way. This is not just about people creating their own echo chambers or filter bubbles of who they are looking at in the little groups they're in. It's also the unseen algorithms that push information towards us that the platforms and others think we'll like. And they do that because these are massive advertising systems that are basically selling your presence on their pages. And they know, and we know, but in their own experiments, the platforms have done, when they've tried to mix up the information that they show people to come from different perspectives, they know that people click away faster, that you stay on longer if you're seeing stuff you already agree with, or fits your worldview. So it's kind of built into the system where the internet is built on surveillance, and confirmation bias is a type of currency that it's got, whereas that's what it kind of trades in, is giving us what we already want to see. So it's really important to see this as systemic, that it's not just one side, or that it's not just evil platforms or evil groups pushing out particular views, and it's not just us being very tribal or wanting to just see what we like. It's the interaction between those two things at a scale that we've not been able to do previously. That's the shift, and that's one of the key worries for our views of reality and our discourse, public discourse more generally.
And Bobby shares very generously at the end of the book 10 principles where we can actually take action about this and actually work on system 2, at least practice that muscle and work that muscle a bit, including the filter bubbles. And we'll talk about filter bubbles in a moment. Again, Bobby, I'm reacting to things you say and jumping around the book. So to clarify things for our audience as well, one of the things you mentioned there is an extremely important term. And we had the great pleasure of having an episode with Aidan Aronson, who is now 91, amazing man. Excellent. Who worked, as you know, with Leon Festinger, trained under Leon Festinger. And Festinger, of course, is the man who brought us the concept of cognitive dissonance. This is extremely important. You mentioned about the pain of changing our mind. Literally, it's painful for the brain, but also it is possible. But many, many leaders in organizations know, for example, there's a melting iceberg. They know the platform is burning, but cognitive dissonance helps them ignore it, even though it's happening in the background.
All of that great work, that goes back decades now, and has been shown in many, many different contexts, shows just how tightly we want to hold on to that existing worldview. And it is well, in the book, it runs throughout the book in lots of different ways, and the kind of tips and tricks that you show are actually, it's kind of, the modern environment has given us some exemplars of how people can get around that, can avoid falling into the worst of that trap. And there was a really interesting experiment on in the US on testing professors and PhD students against fact checkers on how they actually sort reality from fake news online. They were given these tasks to do. And one of the things that I think is a really useful principle more generally is in the end, the fact checkers were much better than the Ivy League professors and PhD students at sorting fact from fiction on this. And the reason was that the PhDs and professors went really deep. They went deep into an individual source, looking down instead of across. And what fact checkers tended to do was just have, in a very sort of pragmatic, practical way, they had dozens of tabs open. They looked across. They looked for verification by going to other sources and opening, following trails that go wide rather than deep. And that's a really interesting skill set and approach in our modern environment, where you do tend to get pulled down into rabbit holes where you're going deeper and deeper into things, which are just, reconfirming what you've already thought rather than going against it. Whereas what the fact checkers do is look widely across. And if you're thinking of that in a cognitive dissonance frame, what they're doing there is really, because they're coming to it with their own biases, they're not automatons themselves. What they're doing there is you're building an evidence base that cuts across to help you change your mind. You may have a view on something that you come to it with, or you've established early on in the process that you think this is the reality, but they check and verify across rather than ploughing on with that one particular thought. And I think that's very relevant to that cognitive dissonance point. Is you're looking to reach that tipping point of changing your mind, and you can do that much better by cutting across than going deep. Is the lesson that I take from that.
Yeah, and I have a mental model for it, Bobby, that I call crossing swim lanes. So you need to swim across the swim lanes rather than actually, or in the whole pool, or explore outside other pools, exactly to your point. And as you know well, it's one of the big challenges we have with the big challenges for the planet is that there's so many experts, but they're not collaborating or diversifying their neurodiversity. Key. And it's also a point for neurodiversity in organizations. The more diverse the mindsets, the better the solutions from people as well. So it's a key point. There was a really interesting part of the Festinger work that you mentioned in the book, which is, yes, it's possible to change minds. Yes, it's possible to change what people think, but sometimes people will cling to realities even when they've been proven wrong. And this is the work of the Festinger, and you mentioned that the apocalyptic cult. This is fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's like it's been seen in lots of different environments since then, but it's that even when your apocalyptic prediction, if you've got a cult that thinks the world is going to end on a particular day and it doesn't end on that day, the steps that people will go through in order to still hold on to that cult belief is incredible in terms of rewriting what the prediction was to be. It was just slightly out, so it's going to be in. I think it's been it's in The Simpsons, isn't it? The Simpsons, always in The Simpsons. Homer has done exactly the same sort of thing. He got the calculation slightly wrong, so you'll go back, and then there's all these tricks and mental gymnastics that you can do to hold on to the belief. And again, I mean, like, the cults are a niche concern, but the reason it's important is it kind of points to how some of us think, how a lot of us get pulled into thinking about our political identities or our connection to particular political parties, because it's quite clear that in some circumstances your political identities become so strong that almost anything is acceptable from the side that you support. And this is one of my big concerns in my day job at King's College London, and as being in a policy institute. now is the extent to which these tribal identities outweigh good decision making in politics or in any other sphere of life, and so that's where all that Festinger work and lots of other great work on cults is not just about understanding the cult. It is about how those tendencies to really hold on to those strong, once those identities get really strong among people, really hold on to them despite all the evidence against, and despite those identities leading to actions we wouldn't normally accept. That is the real problem here, and I kind of that's where we get into culture wars and the tribal identities that culture wars tends to invoke in some countries. And they're the kind of things that you worry about in its impact on wider society. Not that we'll all join cults, but that some of those behaviors leak into more mainstream political impact.
And if you look at any of the history of any type of genocide or any type of tragedy, it always started with a small group of people who had this reality and then built on it and fed other people. And then in times of fear, we're able to manipulate and influence others. And I find it really fascinating that you wrote the book before the pandemic. It must have been fascinating for you to see the pandemic unfold, and in line with things like, and by the way, I'm thinking here, I was going to avoid saying these two words because I know when I put this episode out on YouTube, it will be downplayed in the filter bubble because I'm going to say Trump and Brexit, which you do focus on in the book.
Yeah,
that's us going to limit our views, by the way, on YouTube, because you get actually limited if you mention things like that are political. So, but there's a key before we get into that, and before we get into inoculation, because you do go right back to the polio inoculation and vaccines. And I think that's really important for people to know that what we saw unfold during the pandemic and the conspiracy theories, etc., is not uncommon. This is actually common. This has happened before in the past. There's been rejections, etc. We'll get into that in a sec, but there's a key paragraph that I'd love to quote, and maybe you'll riff on this one, Bobby. You said, "These days, information technology and social media present even more challenges to our perception of facts. Given the extent to which we can filter and tailor what we see online and how it is increasingly done without us even noticing or knowing it. Filter bubbles and echo chambers incubate our misperceptions." Beautifully said. "Unseen algorithms and our own selection biases help create our own individual realities. The pace of technological progress that is allowing this splintering is frightening, but also so apparently complex and unstoppable that it's numbing. A very few years ago, the suggestion that we would be, each of us be experiencing our own individual realities online would seem like something out of Black Mirror. But now it's accepted with a shrug. That is dangerous because it plays to some of our deepest psychological quirks, our desire to have our already held views validated, and our instinctive avoidance of anything that challenges them." Now, I know you've built on that a little bit, but maybe you'll want to riff on that. A beautifully written paragraph.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, look, this is constantly moving, and the challenge is the technology outpacing our abilities to regulate or think about what we're actually designing. It just sort of happens, and there's been an awful lot of people that have been involved in creating those types of online worlds who've had a lot of mea culpa moments afterwards, and gosh, I wish I hadn't quite done that in terms of putting in the capabilities without thinking how it interacts with our human biases. And I think that's one of the themes of how that online environment has grown, as we actually thought. I think it was lots and lots of people who did genuinely think that this is just going to make things better because you're opening up information and opportunities for people to connect in ways that just weren't possible before. So there's lots and lots of upsides, and those upsides are true, but we just didn't also think that we've got these human biases and we're going to pull it towards those biases of wanting to be in an in-group against an out-group, confirmation bias and those cognitive dissonance points, the focus on negative and emotional information that, we know that emotional information and conflict-based information travels further and faster in these social media environments. So it creates a sense of division that doesn't reflect the reality. A lot of my work since the book has been on that sort of polarization of societies, and it is built into these platforms that more negative and more emotional and more conflict-based language will travel further and faster online. The more reasoned debate. So we got sort of portraying this image of a very divided world that is at odds with each other, that doesn't really reflect the reality outside of that when you actually see people in real life. But the point about the technology is it just keeps changing. And I was, at the writing of the book, we were very worried about deep fakes and deep fakes being used in political settings, deep fakes being, proper, where you can just have anyone type in anything that you want someone to say, and the video will look like they are saying it. And that is a worry in all sorts of environments. But now you've got, looking forwards, you have got the metaverse type proper virtual reality strands coming. And that will be people creating their own realities and living in their own realities as it develops. So yeah, these and the problems are really difficult to regulate against or control those types of technologies, because it's just moves so fast and the regulation moves so slow. So we need to come up with better ways of thinking about what do we want to achieve through this, because there is this sense that there's nothing you can do and it's just happening, and we have to accept it. And there's some more encouraging signs that people, governments and organizations like the European Commission are starting to think more seriously about how we can actually impose some sort of order on this and try to improve the environment. So I think more encouraging signs, but incredibly difficult to do, incredibly difficult to control this, and lots of downsides in trying to control it. You don't really want state-sponsored truth either. How you intervene in order to avoid the worst of these sorts of environments, while not giving control over the environments to state authorities or other regulators is a really, really tough line to tread.
And then you think about, you were talking about state truths there. I mean, if you think about the BBC or any type of national broadcaster, their role should be for content, but when they have a commercial intent or in commercial responsibility, they compete against these organizations who don't really care. They want to just get the information out there, and that's no disrespect to those organizations, but speed and if it bleeds, it leads are so important in those realms. But then they may miss the boat with the content. It may be later, maybe slower. And I know there's some entities out there that have slower news on purpose, but it's more fact-checked, etc. But in a lot of cases, people don't care because they're consuming on social media. They're just consuming the headline in many cases. And as you say, that feeds their realities. They believe that's realities as well. But we won't go into there. We've covered that before. And there's a lot of, that's a show in itself that we won't go into. But I wanted to add something else that's also a difficulty. So when I played a 10-year career as a rugby player, Bobby, I played over in London Irish. And I wasn't the most talented player, but I was really disciplined, and I looked for any kind of edge that I could get, including diet. So diet or training. And this was betraying my age here, pre-YouTube, pre-internet at the way we know it today. So content was difficult to find. Information was difficult to find. And I used to think, oh, if only I had the information then. But today, the amount of information is actually causing a totally different issue. One is you find conflicting information for everything. And that means people don't know where to look. Like I've looked at this for everything from ADHD, for people with autism, for any type of, for even the pandemic, for is the vaccine causing heart attacks? Is it not? All this type of different things. And this is really difficult for people because it's not only the filter bubble, it's an overload of information. Absolutely. TMI, too much information.
Absolutely, yes. And it is it is a problem, and it's related to that, all the great work on the paradox of choice, that where actually giving people lots of choice makes it really difficult for them to make a choice, because you can have too much. And it's the same sort of thing with this information about who to believe. And it's kind of, and we've made some mistakes in this as well, as in society and media organizations, because it was there's big discussions at the BBC and other media outlets about balanced reporting, where you would often see, reports on, say, vaccine safety or climate change and human-made climate change, and you would say, what the understanding of balanced reporting was you would have 80 or 90% of the program or segment would be, yes, everyone agrees vaccines are safe, or that humans have had a role in climate change. But there's these couple of people who think that that's not the case. Vaccines are unsafe, or climate change isn't human driven. And the trouble with that is that people hear and hold on to that exception rather than the reality of this. And I've got a survey, a big study coming out across Europe. It hasn't been released yet, but we asked people in that about their perceptions of what percentage of climate scientists do you think agree that climate change is human driven. And the reality, according to lots of studies, is something like 99.7 or 99.3 or whatever it is really incredibly high among climate scientists. But the average guess is people think that about 70% of climate scientists agree that it's a human, that climate change is human driven. So much, much lower perception. They think that's the average guess. So the people who think even lower and people who think a bit higher. So you got this, people think that 30% of climate scientists don't think it is. And that's partly because how people do these sorts of estimates. But it is also because they see these exceptions and they take up more space than the reality is. And you also kind of are drawn to exceptions when you are presented with information. So that's a real challenge, not just the volume of information, it's also how our brain works in processing that, where we're a bit drawn to those exceptions and they're given more weight, even though they don't reflect that weight in reality. So it's a real problem.
We've talked about that. We've talked about the challenges, and we'll get into the solutions, your 10 kind of principles at the end of the show. But I'd love to delve a little bit deeper into some of the surveys and what they unveiled. And I'm really interested in the next topic. We cover it a bit on the show because we're interested in healthy body, also because it's good for a healthy mind and actually helps you make more decisions, helps you consume more content if you're going to be working, and it helps you attend better. And you tell us identifying misperceptions about health is really, really important for us. Doing so forces us to look at the realities of how we take care of ourselves. And in many cases, the actual health statistics are absolutely shocking. And you uncover so many of these in the book. And this is especially true when it comes to our weight and diet. I'd love you to share this with our audience. This stuff was absolutely shocking to me.
Yeah, no, we have a terrible misperception of our own, our national level healthiness. So we just massively underestimate how many of us are overweight or obese. And it was a shock to me. I mean, the realities are a shock, first of all. I mean, this is one of those when you collect all the data and you find, 2/3 of people are overweight or obese in the US, and it's not much better here in the UK, and the islands not similar as well. So it's all these, the realities are incredibly high, but the estimates are really quite low as well. So you've got big gaps here where you've got people down at some of the countries, it's like people estimating 4 in 10 or 3 in 10 people, so half in some. And, in some countries like Saudi Arabia, just incredible state of denial about the extent to which they have a weight problem as a nation. So yes, now you've got these incredible gaps, and the worry about that is it shows that we're not worried enough, if you see what I mean, because it's kind of, we know that when people are concerned about something, they tend to inflate it in their minds. And this shows that we're, even with all the evidence and all the discussion on these types of things, we still don't quite get how bad it is. And that's a lot related to our sort of social set and how we compare ourselves with others, and all those problems, because we think the people, that we're not too overweight ourselves and the people around us look similar to us, and that creates this sense that it's all okay when it's actually not at all. So it's one of the ones, and it's quite unusual in the scope of the book, where we tend to be too worried about things. On some of these personal health ones, we're not worried enough, and that affects how we react. Because if you think it's okay, you're less likely to take action, and that is a worry on our health.
Yeah, no, I'd like to come back to one of the key principles of all that, which is where you were saying about climate change. And we're doing this magnificent series. We're in the midst of it with Jeffrey West of the Santa Fe Institute on climate change and the planet, essentially. And I thought of him when I was reading your book, and I'm going to mention to him, one of the things that you say is that it's almost because there's so much content out there that actually has sometimes a detrimental effect about the alarming changes that we're experiencing, that we kind of go towards a new meme and we think, oh, well, somebody else is on it because we've got it covered because it's so much in the press, etc. And that can actually have a backfire effect for many things. And I thought that was really interesting, both with the health issues, but also with the planet as well.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I do think it's really interesting about what's the right level of worry and concern that you should have to encourage change on an issue. It's a really fascinating area that campaigners are struggling with all the time, about what's the line of getting people worried and concerned enough, but not think that it's hopeless and all done, and so there's no point in doing anything about it. And it's this really interesting interaction between concern, but also a sense of efficacy, that we can actually affect change. And this, again, it's an important thing for leaders in organizations, particularly ones that need transformation, is that extent of getting, and you recognize it in your own kind of running of organizations, is getting the sense of burning platform, but without, they say, it's just going to burn down and there's nothing you can do about it. And and that is very much the case in things like climate, about how do you get people to take it seriously enough, because it's more of a future risk than very current in day-to-day experience. But we need to act now, but it's huge and relies on other people acting, and all of those things make it really difficult to get people at the right level of concern. And there was lots of angst around a book by David Wallace Wells, which was about uninhabitable Earth, which some climate campaigners were saying is worse than climate denial, because what he did was bring together all the worst case scenarios and say what would happen if all of these things happened. And it made it, for some people, the argument was it made it sound hopeless. And that put people off making change. And then other people would push back and say, no, that's not the case. You need these sorts of books. An incredibly popular book that there's no doubt opened some people's eyes to the problems involved. So it's a really complex area about correct level of concern to promote change without either too much complacency or too much fatalism that nothing can be done. I find that really fascinating and a really useful thing to think about in more day-to-day problems.
And there's a lovely red thread to later on in the book where you introduce a section called One versus Many. And here you tell us about the work of Paul Slovic, a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon, who has studied what he termed, beautiful term, psychic numbing for decades, which is where the scale of tragedies or need for help drive us to inaction, which is tied to what you said there. But I thought this was particularly fascinating with the Ukraine crisis at the moment, because he states most of us are caring and will exert great effort to rescue the one whose plight comes to their attention. But these same people often become numbly indifferent to the plight of the one who is one of many in a much greater problem. Why do good people ignore mass murder and genocide, you ask? Specifically, it is our inability to comprehend numbers, again, that innumeracy problem, and relate to them, to mass human tragedy that stifles our ability to act. I thought that, again, was fascinating. And again, linking that to transformation efforts, you need to keep it in the right level of attainment. So can I do it? Is it possible? Or is the task just too big?
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's one sort of example from Slovic and others' work that I really liked, which was when he runs these experiments about how much would you donate to different causes with people, and one of them was about providing safe water to a refugee camp, I think it was, and he played with the scales that you would use. So one was both were saving 100,000 people. If you gave this donation, you would ensure that 100,000 people got this safe water. But in one of the examples, it was a camp that was 100,000 people, and you would save everyone. And the other was 100,000. You would be able to get to 100,000 people out of 300,000 people that were in this camp. And people were much more willing to give money to the 100,000 camp, so where everyone was given access to safe water, even though it was the same number of people in the 300,000 camp that would get the safe water under his scenario. And that's just really interesting. And it shows that we like solutions. We like to think, if I do this, then that's that thing solved and I can tick it off. Not that I'm helping towards this, in this case, to the same scale. I'm helping towards a bigger problem at the same scale. So that's really interesting when you think of the complexity of human emotions, and particularly if you're doing transformation work or you're working in businesses more generally, that sense of completion, or I am sorting this properly, is really important to us, rather than just I am making progress. And that's really useful to think about that when you're communicating and trying to inspire teams.
There's so many elements, isn't there, that you have to keep. And I'm very wary as well with the show of giving too much information, but also giving almost like breadcrumbs towards the ability to make the change happen, and that it's not unattainable. But there's a really fascinating thing that is linked to this, and I'm also always reminded of Leo Tolstoy's quote here. He said, "Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself or herself. And this is linked to your section on herd behavior, because you say we have to be so cognizant of the dangers of our herding instinct as a species. And the quote that I picked here is, "It seems we may be in denial on our personal consumption of sugar, and we're definitely underestimating how fat we are, as we've discovered. But there remains the key question of whether better communicating the huge scale of our health challenges to people actually help shift behavior," to what you were talking about. It seems obvious that knowing the truth is an important first step to acting on it. But is it, you ask? And you go on to say, our focus should instead be on individual behavior and overcoming personal barriers to healthier choices, rather than on a societal epidemic where it's all too easy to just go along doing the same things as everyone else. Again, as you said, seeing people around you. And I thought, again, this is interesting to those change makers who listen to the show, because we try to boil the ocean rather than actually start with the willing, those people who are willing to make the change, get some small wins, and then build on those successes. I'd love you to give your view on that, Bobby.
Yeah, I mean, it's very connected to that point of hope and hopelessness that people can have in this. And it is particularly, around health type behaviors. We know that it's not particularly helpful to just bang on about a obesity epidemic, and it doesn't motivate people. It doesn't personalize it for them, and it can give the sense of hopelessness that this is beyond our control, as well as a sense that this is the norm. And like one of the linking to your point about the herding, we are incredibly social creatures, where what our perception of the norm is really important in our own behavior. And there's great experiments on this or research on this in Princeton University in 1960s or 70s, where they had a very strong drinking culture, and new vice chancellor comes in and is worried about this, and wants to ban keg parties where you got lots of beer, and got lots of pushback from people about doing that. So they did some research on it, and what they found was that there was a whole stack of people who actually didn't really like that drinking culture, but they thought it was the culture. So they were all protesting for something where quite a lot of them didn't actually want it to continue, because they thought it was the norm. And this was what they thought, that everyone else loved it, when actually there was a big chunk of them, if they'd been more honest about what they were thinking, actually didn't love it, but they wouldn't express that because they felt they'd be out of line with the norm. And that's one of the key, again, these lines that you've got to tread, where you want to on like an obesity crisis, where you want to say we've got a real problem with this, and it's very widespread, without turning, it's very difficult then not to turn it into a norm. As in, if you're telling people this is a really widespread outcome for lots of people, it also makes it feel like that is the social norm, and we will follow the social norms rather than fight against them. So it's a tricky one, and wherein you'll have seen increasingly in communications or health communications on that, tend not to get those big messages of crisis or this is widespread from health bodies, but much more tailored, much more specific, and much more what we can do type messages, rather than just describing a widespread problem. And that's not because there's a denial of it as an issue. It's just because actually it's not very effective and quite risky to just bang on about the scale of the problem.
It reminds me of an Emerson quote, that to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest achievement. And the reason I say that is the herding instinct. I played rugby, and as you know, rugby has a certain ethos. It's changed a lot in professional rugby, but I wasn't ever much of a drinker, and it was always a challenge for me. Like I used to leave the game, go home, do my recovery sessions because as I say, I wasn't that talented, so I had to do those little bit extra. So I usually wouldn't drink very much because I knew how detrimental it was to recovery. But I incurred a huge wrath for that, going against the herd mentality. And even now in my career, essentially as a gig economy worker, is unusual for people, and they can't get their head around it. And it can be challenging. And you know, I say all that to say, think of our children, because one of the great benefits of trying to play sport at that age, at a young age, was it brought you into a different type of community that was somewhat interested in its health. You know, so you had a game at the weekend, therefore you didn't, you never dabbled in drugs or anything like that because it just wasn't in your consciousness. And it makes me always think about my children again, is that it's so important who they're surrounded by. Their friends, their teachers, their communities are so important, because that probably has a bigger influence than the parent alone, because they're constantly around those people. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think that our environments are incredibly important, and it's like particularly on health, and I kind of in our wider work, the model of the social determinants of health is incredibly well explored now, and really, great work by it's a whole series of people, but Michael Marmot is probably most associated with it from a UK perspective, is just looking at the whole panoply of effects on people's health that is all to do with, a lot to do with family, it goes from genetics to family to, it goes in these concentric circles of different types of effects, but where, who you're around, who you see, as well as the health services and systems that support you. It's a kind of this complex interplay from different directions, but where your environment has a huge effect on you. And it's not just about individual characteristics or willpower or genetics or all those types of things. It is very much a socially determined outcome, health, and you've got to keep that in mind.
And one of the other things is, as we know, education. So when the parent shows more interest in the kids' homework and education, more likely to perform better in school. And then also I read one about reading that when the parent has books around the house, even just lying around, the kid's more likely to read. Yeah. So I think it's important to know that if you have the privilege of being a parent, or even as an auntie or an uncle or something, to be encouraging the children in that way. But I wanted to jump to something we mentioned earlier on, and not to disappoint our audience, because I found your book and this section almost prophetic, because you wrote it, as I said, before the pandemic. And I'll intro this as you do in the book. And the section you call it is Inoculating Against Ignorance. So here we go. It's 12th of April, 1955, 10 years to the day from the death of President Roosevelt, the world's most famous polio victim. We're at the University of Michigan waiting to hear the results of Dr. Jonas Salk's trial of a polio vaccine. 500 people are in the room, including 150 from the media, along with 16 television cameras, some relaying the results to 54,000 physicians in cinemas across the country. People are listening to the radio in the US and all around the world. The results are broadcast on department store loudspeakers, and judges suspend trials so people can listen. Paul Offit, the vaccine scientist, writes, "The presentation was numbing, but the results were clear. The vaccine worked. Inside the auditorium, Americans tearfully and joyfully embraced. Church bells were ringing across the countries. Factories were observing moments of silence. Synagogues and churches were holding prayer meetings, and parents and teachers were weeping. It was as if a war had ended," one observer recalled. Salk received a gold medal from President Eisenhower, and in 1985, President Ronald Reagan proclaimed that this country should celebrate Salk Day. Salk had ensured the impact of his discovery by not patenting the vaccine. When asked by an interviewer who owned the patent, he replied, Well, the people, I would say, there is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Fast forward to present day, and the contrast between those scenes and how those currently working on vaccines are viewed by a section of the public could not be starker. You wrote this before the vaccine. I found that or before the pandemic. I found that absolutely fascinating. And maybe you'll give us a bit of your viewpoint on the polio vaccine, and then the change. And bearing in mind, again, you were talking about the change before the recent pandemic, and that has just exasperated it even further.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting area, because it was one of the questions that I was most worried about, I suppose. One of the results that I was most worried about, even before the pandemic, because what we found was that we asked people whether some vaccines cause autism in healthy children. Not whether they can, it was like a statement of fact. True or false, some vaccines cause autism in healthy children. It was really worrying, because this was around 35, 37 countries that we asked this, and only 4 in 10 people said it was definitely false, that that's the case. And then 1 in 5 people said it was definitely true, that it does cause, some vaccines cause autism in healthy children. This was obviously based on the controversy around the MMR vaccines that you will have seen, which you come back to. And then there was a lot of people in the middle. You got the rest of them in the middle saying, I don't know whether it does or not. And that in itself is a worry, just not knowing, that kind of sense of doubt. And so that's the context. You got only 1 in 5 people definitely saying, 1 in 5 people definitely saying that it's true, and only 4 in 10 people definitely saying that it's false, that you've got this risk from vaccines. And that was a terrible context going into a pandemic where vaccines were going to be absolutely crucial elements of our getting back to normal life and saving people's lives. And I think that what it's shown really is that what the experience of the pandemic has shown is that actually we've done pretty well in coming out of the pandemic and in acceptance of vaccinations across lots of countries, not all, because there's been problems in some countries, but we've actually done pretty well from it. And it's a really good case study in how do you engage people in these types of information-based decisions that they have to take, because it really, the campaigns in lots of the countries applied lots of the learning from previous vaccination type studies. There was a lot of work on the behavioral science of this and how to get people to accept it. So modeling behaviors, making sure that people know it's the norm, really detailed work of getting into communities that have more skepticism about vaccination through using their own leaders, not external people trying to come in and tell them what to do. And vaccination rates have been pretty high in it. And it's so I think we've got to take the positives from that experience, is that we've learned a lot about that. But then still, what we're left with is a rump of vaccine skeptics through to conspiracy theorists who are not insignificant in the population. There are we have asked new questions around the pandemic, specifically about whether Bill Gates is actually using the vaccine to microchip us and all of those types of things. And you will get, 1 in 20, up to 1 in 15 people agreeing with those kind of crazy ideas. And then you get more people who have got concerns about skepticism about how quickly it was developed, and still fears about side effects that are exaggerated in many ways. And so you got kind of a total of about 15-ish% of people who have got that kind of rejectionism. So it's still not insignificant as a problem, but it could have been much worse, looking at what we were coming from in terms of the bad context that we'd built around vaccine safety. And so I think that is a real lesson, going back to giving so much oxygen to people like Andrew Wakefield, who was a UK researcher who was given a lot of space in media discussions of vaccine safety. And even though he was discredited, the research was discredited, it kind of stuck with people and informed debates across the world, including in the US. So we need to learn those lessons about setting that sort of context, and then build on the good lessons from the pandemic about how do you actually engage people on these types of things to encourage the behavior. And then I suppose the final point I'd say on this, though, is the trouble with all of that is while it's not big proportions of people who are rejectionists or conspiracy theorists on vaccines, what it has done is reinforced some of those communities because they've been pushed into enclaves on this and sharing their connections on these types of things. And there is these types of events can increase that connection to those types of groups and that sense of radicalization among those groups. Because what tends to happen is people get pulled into one conspiracy theory, and then it's a bit of a rabbit hole into others. And conspiracism can lead to radicalization, which can lead to more extreme acts. So there is the pandemic has created an environment where, for a minority rather than the majority, it can push people into quite dangerous places, and that's a worry, and all driven by how people see realities and how that ties up with their identity, and then how it becomes self-reinforcing about being a member of a group, and just as the kind of cult theories have shown us.
I found it interesting as well that when I spoke to Elliot Aronson, he said that the more difficult it is to get into a group, the more you'll actually obey the rules of that group, and the more you'll feel kind of grateful to be part of that group.
Yeah.
But then I also thought about how social media and the filter bubbles play such a large role in this, because I have empathy in a way for many people who are in that world. So if you go to any of those kind of more conspiracy theory versions of YouTube, if you want to call them that people consume content, it's often the same content over and over and over. Mm-hmm. And or else if you do consume it on places like YouTube, again, the filter and the algorithm plays in. So they're only seeing one view of the world, and it's always confirming, as you mentioned, as well. And then when it's disconfirming, they listen for the little chink in the armor and they go for that and ally with that as well. So I thought that was really interesting, and thanks for raising it, or thanks for clarifying it. And it probably raises a question, and I'm sure lots of people have experienced this. We all know somebody, and it may be a family member, maybe you, who don't agree with the vaccine and don't agree with what has unfolded. But oftentimes the question of education comes up, and, oh, well, it's an education thing, or it's a country by country thing. And you are not wrong. There is a huge influence of education and country by country. It's a huge thing Bobby has uncovered in his book. We probably won't have time to go deep into that. But I thought the education thing was interesting as well, because I raised it earlier on, and I don't want to let anyone down who's interested in that. And one of the ways you uncover this was through, for example, teenage pregnancy rates and the perception versus the reality, which is starkly different. And I tested this on a few people, and I found, again, some people, very highly educated people, got it really, really wrong. And then other people got it actually much more accurate. And there was also, I found, a difference between gender as well, which was interesting as well. So over to you here, because this is a great case study of the overall mindset of misperceptions and perceptions.
Yeah, no, I mean, the teenage pregnancy one is fascinating, and I do use that a lot because that is such a case study of emotional innumeracy in a sense. So I mean, from your audience's point of view, it's good to think about the question, which is what percentage of women and girls aged 15 to 19 in your country do you think give birth each year? And the answer in, let's just take Britain, but it's not out of line with others, is 1.4%. But the average guess in Britain is 19%, that 1 in 5 do. But then in the US, it's 2%, the reality, and the average guess is 24%, not a quarter of teenage girls give birth each year. And, it's extraordinary. And obviously, when you think about that for just a second, you would think that's absurd that 1 in 5 people, so you've got an all-girl class of 30 and 6 of them are having babies every year is quite extraordinary when you think about it. No, not realistic when you think about it. But it is that what we will be doing is remembering the stories. Well, we're doing 2 big groups of things. We'll be remembering the stories that we have seen because they'll stick in our minds. They're negative, usually framed quite negatively, and negative information sticks. But it's also quite an emotional story, so that kind of sticks with us. We are also really bad at updating our views over time because teenage pregnancies have halved in the past 30 years across most countries. It's kind of a massive drop in teenage pregnancies, but we're not very good at updating our images. We get kind of stuck on old perceptions of problems in particular. So yes, and then we've got this. So that's like a great case study, and it is related to education levels, and across the studies as a whole, there is an education effect from this, where you will tend to find people who've got higher levels of education tend to be better, not on all things, and there's some lovely complications here that are shown in other experimental work where actually if you've got an issue that is really tightly tied to your identity, like a political issue, say gun control in the US, it's actually the more numerate people who tend to get things more wrong because they can torture the data to fit their existing worldview better. So if you're asking people what's true or false from different things and you're presenting them with information about it, they will do these mental gymnastics. The kind of more educated or more numerate people will do these mental gymnastics to try to work out, how can I keep this in line with my worldview? So it's not a perfect relationship by any means to education, but there is an element of that. What I did find fascinating across the estimates was when we looked across all the different countries. On one of the studies, we asked lots of different questions. Then we asked people how confident they were in their guesses. And there was this almost perfect relationship between the more confident the people in the country were with their estimates, the more wrong they were with their estimates across lots of different types of questions. And this is the classic Dunning-Kruger effect, where it's where you don't know about a subject, your very ignorance of that subject makes you overconfident because you think you know more than you actually know. So you've got this is really important in understanding these types of studies, is that confidence can be inversely related to correctness on this. So listening to confident people on lots of these issues is no guarantee that you're listening to the truth.
Dunning-Kruger is absolutely fascinating, and I think it's really interesting to tell the story of the bank robber and the lemon juice. This is really fascinating because it's an exaggerated version of it, but one of the things I have learned, and I'm sure you know it from the mental research you've done, is that I think it was Newton said, what we know is a drop. And the more you learn what you don't know. And that's one of the things I find remarkable. Really well-read and well-researched people often are the most racked with doubt because they know so much. And somebody who is more ignorant or less educated on a subject is actually more likely to take action because of their lack of information. And this was certainly the case with this bank robber.
Yeah, no, it's a great story. And it's, I mean, boil it down to the poor guy thought that covering your face in lemon juice meant that you wouldn't show up on security cameras, and obviously that doesn't work, and he got caught. It was incredibly confident about his plan, and it's it is it is a powerful effect, and exactly as you say, it is important. Like the lesson that I take from it, because the danger is it sort of you tip into patronizing people who are less educated on things, and it's not the point of it. I think as an analysis option, it is the point about it is to separate in your mind confidence from correctness, I guess. And I think it's another one of those little mental ticks. Is we are quite drawn to confident people and people who are presenting their views as the reality or very definitely the thing that you need to do. It's kind of, we look for that leadership type things, and again, that sees us well in lots of different situations. But I think there is that useful step back and system 2 type approach of just checking and verifying that a little bit when we are following someone or following their recommendations, at least. So yeah, that's the thing that I take from it more is to qualify how much weight we give to confidence.
I've already triggered the algorithm here, Brexit and Trump. So in that respect, because what happens is it reads the transcript, you see, the YouTube reads the transcript and the algorithm knows, and then it can actually go, you can't say, for example, boost a video to try and reach people. So Cambridge Analytica, for example. And this is important because we talked about, you mentioned there about the more confident somebody is, overconfident, Trump comes to mind, the mere exposure effect comes to mind because of Trump Towers, him being on the TV, all these type of things had an effect. But you cover it in depth in the book. We won't have time to cover it in depth, but because I mentioned it, some people will be annoyed if we don't cover it. So I'd love you to just give a high level view of both.
So yeah, now, as you can imagine, in a book on misperceptions and realities or bending realities, Trump featured quite a lot, actually, because he was so many stories around how he treats realities. Maybe the one that sticks out most with me is just how he talked about murder rates in US cities, where he just went around on the campaign trail saying murder rate is the highest it's ever been. It's been in the US for 40 years. And it just wasn't true. It was based on a small slither of truth about murder rates had gone up in some US cities year on year, but they were still much lower than 30 or 40 years ago. But he just kept saying it 6 or 7 times on the trail. And it was such a good example of illusory truth bias of you just keep saying these things, they're not true, or you kind of or whether you know or not, you just keep plowing away with it because it's it will have an effect and set a tone, and people will keep hearing it, and then more people will believe it as a result. So he was that was a key aspect of his campaigning, is just keep saying those types of things, which is happens in politics, but he's an extreme example of how you just keep saying it. And then Brexit is interesting because it was for me, it was much more about the tribal identity points that you, in the UK context, Brexit identities became incredibly strong, much stronger than your party political identity. People strongly identifying with whether they were a Leaver or a Remainer. So when you put to people whether the pledge to spend that we send £350 million per week to the European Union was true or false, massive disparity between Leavers and Remainers on whether they believed that or not. Hardly any Remainers believed it. A huge proportion of Leavers believed it, and that's that's the same reality, but seen entirely differently depending on your political identity in this case. And so that's a real real life example of our directionally motivated reasoning or confirmation biases. People who will be believing that will be looking for information that reinforces it, and people who don't believe it will be looking for information that neglects it or rejects it. So they're kind of Trump and Brexit were riven with that interplay of views of reality and our identity and the leaders on all sides were really playing with that and playing on those types of biases.
And if only there was an algorithm where you could actually boost information and target the specific people that you wanted to influence them even more.
Yes, exactly.
So,
exactly.
By the way, I just want to say the book is fascinating and must read. And Bobby has another book called Generations as well. He wrote over the last couple of years that is just launched as well. And I'd love you to have you on in the future as well on that, Bobby. It's brilliant work. So important for us to make sound decisions as much as we can make. That's for sure. But also for anybody interested, immigration is in there. Our sexual lives is in there. Everything is in the book. Everything's covered on these great studies from Ipsos Mori and Bobby's work and with King's College, etc. But I thought we'd finish, and we've 10 minutes, so 10 and 10. If the challenge is with you, Bobby, if you will, I'll share these 10 ways that we can manage our perceptions. And you set up this section by saying the starting point for most discussions of why we're so wrong is to view the answer as solely out there in the context. We're wrong only because we've been misled, rather than it is being how we think, the repeated errors that we make. So we can be conscious about this. We can make some changes. We can exercise the muscle. And then in pointing out cognitive traps, you establish that we're not entirely slaves to them. And you share 10 ideas of how we can form more accurate views of the world. They have broad applications for how we see the world, what we prioritize, and how we approach new information. So the 10 are as follows. I'll read out one. Bobby, you'll riff on it and give us an overview. The first is, things are not as bad as we think, and most things are getting better.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's this relates to the emotional numeracy point that we will change our view of reality because we've got this sense of that focus on negative information and sense of decline. So we just starting with that point, that actually knowing that, in particular, knowing that we are at the end of a long evolutionary chain of humans where treating negative information as urgent and important is built into us. So this goes all the way back to cave people days of how negative information tended to be threat-based information. So if you didn't take notice of it, say that lurking saber-toothed tiger that was about to pounce on you, then you're edited out of the gene pool. So we are kind of, we're conditioned on a long process to focus on the negative. And it's done as well as a species to be quite cautious and to focus on that type of thing. But it means that we tend to think things are worse than they are and that things are getting worse. So yeah, just having that in mind, that it's not as bad as you think, probably not as bad as you think, is a really useful starting point when you're looking at any of these realities.
And the second, again, we touched on this throughout the show, was accept the emotion, but challenge the thought.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting one, and it's kind of almost therapy-like. That actually comes from a therapist, Andrew Marshall, who has written lots and lots of books on relationships and midlife crises in particular, and it's a very similar point to the Kahneman one about system one and system two. Is you've got to realize you're going to have an initial emotional reaction to this, and you can't stop that. It will happen, and that's not that it's not actually healthy for you to try to stop that initial emotional reaction to these types of things. But once that has gone, you can challenge the thought that it leads to and think about, is that the emotion driving this, or is that my misperceptions driving this, or is it real? So, and that's where you're trying to get system two to kick in and consider things a bit more carefully.
And then 3 is cultivate skepticism, but not cynicism.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, this one. This is another treading the line one, because what you want people to be skeptical, to think about the information and not just believe it immediately, but you don't want people to be utterly cynical and just reject all information, or to completely flip-flop and believe the last thing they were told without any kind of belief in something. Because we as humans, you want to have value system, we have beliefs, we have identities, all of those types of things. So it's a tricky one, and it's about us just checking with ourselves. Are we being too cynical about a particular an opposing point of view? What we tend to do is really question the motives of the other side, while assume good motives for people on our side of a debate. So that's where you tip into this cynicism that just rejects other sides. So that skepticism, cynicism line is one really worth having in mind when you're considering new information.
And another one then, number 4, is other people are not as like us as we think.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Some of the biggest errors that you see in the book overall are thinking that our own circle is representative of everything else. There's a great one from where we asked about Facebook membership in different countries, and we asked in India what percentage of Indian people, what percentage of Indians you think are on Facebook, and the reality at the time was about 20%. Maybe a bit under, but the average guess from our sample was about 64%, and that was because these samples were done among online Indians, people living in India who had internet access, because you have to be able to reach them. So that's not a fault of the methodology. That was kind of this very useful bit of the methodology, because what it meant was those Indian respondents that we had were all online, more likely to be Facebook users themselves, their friends, their family, all more middle class connected Indian population, which was utterly unrepresentative of the rest of India in that technological sense. That's some of that one of the biggest gaps that we saw throughout, and it shows you how powerful our comparison set is to us. That we think we are normal, we think we are the norm, but we're not as normal as we think, and that is a really, really important thing to bear in mind.
I definitely know I'm not normal, Bobby.
Yeah, me too.
So number 5 then is one that you alluded to earlier, particularly talking about media and content. Our focus on extreme examples also leads us astray.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is so while we're not entirely normal and our experience is not utterly representative, the kind of conflicting tendency is to just be drawn to the most extreme example. And you think of a lot of our, say, for example, our image of immigration, certainly in a UK context, is we know this from the surveys, is about asylum seekers. When you talk about immigrants, people will be thinking about destitute asylum seekers, when actually that is not the norm for immigrants into a country, because we're drawn to those more extreme examples. Partly we're drawn to it, the media cover it more, but the media cover it more because we're drawn to those types of emotional stories. So again, there's this system of pushing us towards a focus on the extreme, and we just got to bear that in mind.
And the other one, which we've covered before in the show, so you can keep this one short, and I'm bearing in mind your time as well, is unfiltering our world. So getting outside those filter bubbles.
Yes, no, exactly. And there's really easy to say, very difficult to do, but it just takes focus from us. And there are tools, increasing number of tools to help us try and mix up our feed. But do bear in mind that, a lot of this is unseen algorithms, and we won't even know that our world is being filtered for us. So it's not, it's something you need to be actively aware of.
And then the next one is critical, statistical, and news literacy are going to be difficult to shift, but we can do more.
Yeah, this is where we shift into not so much our personal behaviors as what can governments and others do to help this. And I think it is really important that we have changed our news and information environment, and much quicker than we've changed our coaching and teaching of kids and ourselves of how to deal with that environment. And it's not like this is going to be the savior and we just need to get into the school curriculum something on critical literacy and news literacy, and that will sort this out, because it's not much more complicated than that. But it is part of the mix. Our kids, you can't teach the human out of our kids. So they will still have these biases and heuristics like us, and will fall into these types of traps. But you do feel like we haven't kept up, and there's more that we could do to support kids and then adults too.
And as you say in the book, the difficulty is actually getting to change the curricula for schools is a really big one. And, inspired by your book, I was driving my son yesterday and I asked him, rather than going, how was your day at school? I said, what did you disagree with about school today? And that was inspired by you. Next one is facts still count, and fact checking is important.
Yeah. So this is the point that, people still do change their minds. There can be a tendency in these sorts of books or analysis to make people think, oh, so it doesn't matter really, the facts, it's all driven by identity and emotions and all those. But that's not the case. And it can also be the case that people think fact-checking is useless, these kind of fact-checking organizations, because once the lie is out there, it's really difficult to get back. And that is true. It is really difficult. But lots of fact-checking organizations try to build in inoculation, if you like, against the sort of pre-checking of things, trying to get it into the system. So it is still, again, an important part of the jigsaw here is having people that are verifying things and that you can trust. Particularly going back to your point about having so much choice and so much information, what you actually find is the brand can become more important to people. If it's a trustworthy source, people are looking for those. People are looking for some sense of what's trustworthy out there. And those fact-checking organizations and media organizations that use them, like the BBC or some of the other big outlets, that's really important to give people some confidence.
And then number 9 is we're storytelling animals, so we also need to tell the story.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think one of the things that I get into a lot of discussions when you're presenting this at seminars and conferences is none of this focus on facts means that story isn't important. We often think that we've got a choice between using facts or story. But actually, the best and most powerful way to do it is combining the two, trying to tell the story with the facts woven in. So you need the real life individual level stories in order for people to connect, but you can still connect that to more representative facts if you weave it together well.
You've done well keeping it to 10 minutes, Bobby.
Yeah.
Better and deeper engagement is possible.
Yes. No, I think this final point is, again, a sort of broader one. That I'm quite a fan of deliberative democracy, things like citizens' assemblies, which have been important in Ireland and the UK and increasingly across Europe, about deciding on difficult issues where you get people together You present them with lots of evidence and from experts, and the opportunity to discuss that themselves, between themselves. And it doesn't change people's worldviews or their identities, but it does get a more informed opinion from them, where you can actually decide on things. And there has been, really important examples of where things have changed around abortion or approaches to climate change on the basis of these types of deliberative events. I think we have become too disconnected from our politics in many ways, and given more. One of the sort of maybe counterintuitive conclusions of the book is that our misperceptions and struggle with reality doesn't mean that you should take power away from people. It actually means you should give them more, because then you're more incentivized to come to more informed views if there's actually something riding on it. Because people can do that. So having more confidence in people, not less, in the end.
And Bobby, I have a final quote that I pulled from the book that I think just is beautiful and encapsulates everything we've talked about. But before I do that, where can people find you, find out more about your other books and your work, of course?
I'm now director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and that means all my details are available there and very easy to get in touch.
Awesome. And my final quote is as follows, and maybe I'd love you to give a final word and message to our audience as well before we close. The one I have picked is as follows: we naturally look for confirming information and discount disconfirming information. When the evidence reaches a tipping point and there is sufficient weight against our current view, we do switch. The dissonance is emotionally unpleasant, and while we're attached to our current opinions, it becomes less unpleasant to shift than to cling onto them. The message is that we can't always solve misperceptions with more facts alone, but that we definitely shouldn't give up on them entirely. People are marvelously varied, and different approaches work with different people in different situations. I absolutely love that as an inspiring close from my perspective. What about you, Bobby? What's your final message to our audience?
Yeah, I think it is that optimistic message, which seems strange at something that has shown that we can be very wrong and very tribal and very difficult on these types of subjects. But actually, in the end, it's a hopeful point about how people are open to change, how people can be engaged, and how, in some ways, I suppose my final point is to bear in mind our own misperceptions of how bad it is out there on these types of things, on people's perceptions of realities and how immovable and tribal they are becoming. That is also an overblown sense of division, as the research shows. There's much more decency and hope and goodwill out there than is often comes across from how it's portrayed. Beautiful.
The author of Perils of Perception: Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, Bobby Duffy, thank you for joining us.
Been absolutely great. Thanks, Aidan.
I hope you enjoyed that. A lot of information in that show, I know, but I could only get Bobby for one episode, and I wanted to make sure we got the best out of that episode. We only covered a fraction of what's in this book. It's so dense with information. It's absolutely fantastic. And I want to thank our sponsor, Zai, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded products and services, empowering businesses to create multiple payment workflows and move funds with ease. You can check out Zai at hellozai.com. I'll see you soon.